Today I'm working on this 1988 Bertone X19. The first thing I noticed was the rear driver's side brakes were sticking, and there is also oil dripping from the engine, as well as a fuel leak from what looks like a broken hose. I can also hear the exhaust leaking from just under the manifold. Firstly, I'm going to remove the cover. Only a few screws and one nut hold it in place. With the cover off, I can already see oil coming from the seals behind the timing belt. Now, to take the side cover off. There is one screw at the back and three above, then just a wiggle to get the cover out of place. The cover appears quite oily, with oil spread across the engine. Upon removing the upper timing belt cover, I found oil all over the timing belt too. Now, I'm unscrewing the lower part of the cover for full access. As I lower it out of place, I see, as expected, that there is oil inside this cover as well. I'm taking off the distributor cap just so I can see the rotor position and getting the cam into TDC. Now, to undo the pulley nut and loosen the alternator to slacken up the auxiliary belt and remove the pulley wheel. I've cut and split a bit of tube and placed it in the cam belt tensioner spring to hold it in place. Now I'm loosening the tension bearing and slipping off the timing belt. It's normal to see some coolant leak out when the tension bearing nut is loosened. Taking out the old timing belt and trying to pull off the crankshaft gear, but it seems to be stuck. I tried to remove it from all angles, but it won't budge more than a few millimeters forward. But that's enough to get the extraction tool in place and pull it off. I don't see the oil leak coming from this seal, so now I'm going to remove the auxiliary pulley. However, since it's freely spinning, I will need to use the old timing belt to hold the pulley in place and stop it from spinning while I undo the bolt. I'm going to use the same removal procedure with the old timing belt to remove the camshaft pulley. With the camshaft fully removed, I can now see that there is oil leaking from the old seal as well as from behind the auxiliary pulley seal. With the pulleys out of the way, I'm now able to clean up and degrease the area of oil, using a screw to puncture the old seal and give me something to leverage on to extract it. Now, I'll clean the area, lubricate the new seal, and place it over the shaft, making sure the seal is correctly positioned with this plastic tool. Once lined up, I'm just hitting the seal in with this cup and checking over to make sure it's looking good. Now, to do the auxiliary shaft seal, and as there is limited access, the auxiliary shaft cover unscrews with 3 bolts. I should have kept my finger holding the shaft in place while removing the cover. As you can see here, the shaft came out with it. Luckily, this Bertone has an electric fuel pump, so I was able to just slip the shaft back in place. If it had been a mechanical pump, I would have had to remove the fuel pump as the pin would have stopped me from putting the shaft back. Popping out the old seal on the bench, you can see how brittle the rubber has become as it snaps into pieces in my hand, compared to how supple the new replacement one is. Once again, I'm using a cup to drive the seal evenly into the plate. Removing the old gasket, then lubricating the seal, and with a new gasket, slipping it back into place and tightening the bolts to torque specifications. Onto the top seal, where there is enough room to use my seal removal tool to pop it out. With the new seal in place, I'm using a few large washers and the bolt to press the seal into place. Then, once again, I'm using the old timing belt to hold the cam in place as I torque it up to specifications. Now, to put the auxiliary pulley back in place and use a bit of sandpaper to clean up the end of the crankshaft, as there was some corrosion holding the pulley on before. With it cleaned up, it now slips off and on with ease, then aligning the shaft to top dead center. I'm removing the bolt from the engine mount so I can lever the engine into a tilted position. This allows me to get access to torque the auxiliary pulley, as there is not enough room otherwise to do this with the tools I have. The tension bearing is still looking good, so it won't need to be replaced. I will be replacing the timing belt with a new one, then rolling the belt to center it on the pulley. Now with the cam belt tensioner spring back in place and tightening the bearing nut, I have done 2 revolutions, then loosen the nut and retension the spring, repeating the process 3 times to make sure there is no slack in the timing belt and it's even on all sides. Finally, I'll torque the tension bearing. Now, to reinstall the pulley with a new belt, reattach the crankshaft pulley nut and torque it. Then reposition the alternator and torque it in place. Now to just reassemble the timing belt cover and the lower engine covers, check the oil and top up the coolant, as I lost a bit in the process. Later, I'll adjust the timing. Moving on to this rear brake, you can see it's having a hard time rotating. After taking the caliper off, I can see the boot rubber has degraded and softened from being exposed to brake fluid. So I pulled out the old cover and capped off the line. The cylinder would not unscrew with this hand tool, so I ended up using a vise to hold it in place and finally got the cylinder out. I replaced the rubber seal, reinstalled the cylinder and replaced the dust boot. I also found that the brake hose was not passing fluid, so it was also replaced. Now, with it reassembled, the brakes are working properly and the wheel is now moving freely. There is a fuel leak coming from this hose, so it's a simple fix to replace the hose with a new one. Next, I can hear an exhaust leak coming from just below the manifold. Luckily, it's in a relatively easy place to get to. I need to disassemble the rear covers for access and disconnect the O2 sensor. Then undo the lower exhaust support and unscrew the downpipe. When pulling it off, you can see the flange was no longer connected, and this is where the leak is coming from. Taking this pipe off using lots of penetrating fluid, as the nuts have never been taken off before and the locking tabs have almost rusted away. Using an impact driver to remove the nuts and slip out the old downpipe, then remove what's left of the old flange. You can see here that it's cleanly snapped off, and I don't see much welding holding the pipe to the flange. Luckily, I have a spare identical part where you can see the welds are clearly in place. The O2 sensor has never been replaced and the car is already over 100,000 kilometers, so it will need replacing with a new one. Now, to slip back the replacement downpipe, reattach the nuts, connect the downpipe and reassemble the rear covers. Taking it for a test drive, after addressing a fair number of problems, the car is performing well and now has no leaks. For more videos, information and Club Day events, check out our website at x19.com.au or fiatclub.net.au. And as always, thanks for watching.